And so that's how I begin to break down that story. And I'm looking into, okay, not only this entrepreneur is approaching me wanting to share their story, but how do we tell this story in a very powerful, impactful way? And then, yes, it's up to the entrepreneur to share that story. They'll share it. There's a lot of different ways, but majority of them will share it through email or through social media. But it's the entrepreneur is using that as a way to connect with their audience, a way to connect with future clients, a way to connect with past clients who may not have ever heard their story before. It's a way for them to really build a deeper connection in order to continue to build their brand to take it much further.
The actual process from, let's say, from idea to actually creating this film, about how long does that last? And about how long are the films that you create?
Yeah, so that's a tricky question because it depends. It depends on what we have to work with, right? So, for example, I've done projects that have lasted 90 days. We are able to go through road mapping, actually film, and then publish it within 90 days. But projects like Kiesha's project specifically lasted 3 years. Or the interior design project, I worked with him for 6 months before we ever published any content. I'm working with another entrepreneur that's in the direct sales business. We have been working together for a year now. And so it usually depends on the kind of entrepreneur. What story do they have to tell? How many? Because sometimes it will be more than one film that we actually put out. And so, yeah, it depends. It depends. But at the very least, 90 days. At the most, it's been 4 years. The longest client that I've had that I worked with is 4 years.
Sure. Okay. So I'm kind of curious on your relationship with Kiesha and how those worked out. So were they you release them once a week? Was it once a month? Once a year? Because you work with her for 3 years. And how often were you there? Were you there with her every single day, filming for 12 hours a day and then editing? Or how did that process work?
So Kiesha's project was the first one I had ever done this format with. So I'm glad you asked me more detail about that because so with that project, it was an everyday occurrence. I was with her every single day for 3 years. We released part one. So it was 3 parts of the documentary series. We released part 1 after 6 months, part 2 after 9 months, and then part 3 after 12 months. And the reason for that is because we never intended to actually do a documentary series. We actually only intended to do one part. But because she had gone viral with this one documentary and her fans loved it, we decided to continue to do more. But the other reason that we waited so long to put out these other parts was because we needed to collect the content. And so, and to make sure that there's a story there, right? Like it wasn't just about seeing all the different things that she was doing. It was more about how do we craft a story out of this, a story that not only is engaging, but a story she wants to tell. And so, because obviously at the end of the day, with the entrepreneurs that I'm working with, they ultimately have the final say so and the approval of what goes out. But it's what I often push for is being vulnerable, being open, because like I said, I'm usually digging for the story that no one has ever heard, because that's the story that usually needs to be told. For example, like with Kiesha's documentary, there's a story in there, and I believe it's in part 3. But I pushed for this for a while, where she actually tells a story of why she became an entrepreneur. And she tells a story of her father, who was an entrepreneur as well. And he used to own a cigarette business. I think it was distributing cigarettes. But he was murdered when she was 11 years old, and she watched him get gunned down.
Oh, wow.
And everything about her business was about honoring his legacy, honoring the kind of man that he was and the way that he did business. We didn't tell that story until part 3. Part 1 and 2 was more about being bold, being different. But part 3 was really where we got to the core and the heart of, like, this is really why I'm doing this. And so, yeah, I mean, it's every project is different. It usually depends on the client and their goals, their business goals, because ultimately they're not doing this for fun. They're doing it so that they can continue to grow their business, grow their brand. And again, that's usually where I work through in road mapping, where I'm figuring out, okay, why are we here? I call it setting the GPS, right? You know, like, and if you go to your phone and you want to go to a location, you have to tell it what location do you want to go to. And so that's setting the GPS. And I often ask clients, like, okay, where are you looking to go? Like, is this about, making an extra $1 million? Is this about just letting people know that you exist? Is this about brand awareness? Like, where are we headed here? And then once we know where we're headed, we know what the final destination is. We work backwards from there. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, every project is different. But it can take anywhere from 90 days to 3 to 4 years to get to that point of, okay, we're putting this out. We know the story that we want to tell. And this is the way that we're going to make sure people hear it.
Okay. So that makes sense. So what would you say to someone listening, say to this podcast, who maybe doesn't, or is on the fence about whether or not they need a video like this? Like, maybe they're just getting started, maybe they don't have a big following, and again, maybe it's a smaller company, or they're just like a singular artist or writer, or something where they're not building a brand, and they're on the fence of, is it worth making a video about myself? Do people care? Like, what would you say to somebody like that?
Yeah, I would say each of us, whether we're in business or not, we have a brand. And that brand is our story. That's the story that we tell, whether we're going to apply for a traditional job, like a corporate job or a traditional job, or you are just starting out. The one thing that I always start with, and it's how we started this conversation, it is showing behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. Because I think the one thing, we know that in this day and age, 2019, there is much more information out there than we can handle, right? And so if you wanted to create a video, you can literally go on YouTube right now and Google, how do I create a video? Mm-hmm. But the one thing that someone cannot take away from you, whether you're a musician or you're an author or you are going into a new corporate position, the one thing that someone cannot take away from you is your story. It's who you are. And to me, that is the most important thing, is showing those behind the scenes of who you are. How do you think? How do you approach a project? How do you approach a product? That's always the first place to start. Whether you're just starting out in business or you've been in business for 20 years and have never made a video, the first place to start is with behind the scenes, with someone being able to truly get to know who you are, like what you have to say, and trust that you can provide the solution to what they're looking for. And you can do that through behind the scenes content. And so I, not just because I'm in it, not just because I make films for entrepreneurs, but I truly do believe, the one thing that can help you stand out in a sea of noise is video, is being able to document who you are, even if it means just showing who you are as a husband or a wife, what matters to you, right? Like, for example, I'm a thrill seeker, right? Mm-hmm. And last year I skydived out of a plane, 10,000 feet in the air. Mm-hmm. I show that video on stage when I'm speaking, because I don't just want you to come in and listen to me talk about video. I want you to understand who I am. And that's a part of who I am, is that I enjoy doing crazy adventures like that. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think we all have cameras in our hands now. We all have cameras that honestly are really great cameras. Mm-hmm. And that's our phones. And so, when you're taking pictures, when you're doing video, I would suggest not just doing it to capture a memory, but doing it to show who you are as a person.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, great. So with everything that you've done and experienced so far, what would you say has been the best advice that you have ever received?
The best advice that I've ever received is keep going no matter what. What's interesting to me as I film these entrepreneurs, as I tell these stories, is that that's the same narrative that keeps coming up, is keep going no matter what. Mm-hmm. Being relentless. I tell the story of a guy named Ted Rubin, who is a social media marketer, and he came up under Seth Godin. He learned under Seth Godin and now is doing his own thing. But he went through, I think it's been over a decade now, where he went through this very hard time of fighting to keep both his daughters in his life. He went through a very nasty divorce with his wife, and he tells this story of this dad won't quit. And even when he speaks on stage, he tells this story because he always relates it back to marketing and how, as entrepreneurs or as businesses, big businesses, we're constantly telling people what to do. What do we want them to do? What do we want them to buy from us? And he relates it back to, it's not so much about what you want them to do and how you want them to buy from us. It's building a relationship. And so literally, even though he has had a hard time with building a relationship with his daughters, he never gives up. In the story, he tells a story about how, in the documentary that I did for him, he tells a story about how his daughter has him on blocked. Like, she blocks his text messages and his phone calls. And they're in person having a conversation, and he's like, look, I understand we're still having a hard time, but you've got to unblock me from your phone. Mm-hmm. And, he says, what if you have an emergency? And she responds, well, you're the last person that I'm ever going to call if I have an emergency. And instead of being angry, instead of being upset, he says, look, after you call your mom, you call your stepdad, you call your grandfather, you call your grandmother, and they all tell you it's too hard, it's too far, it's too much. You're going to call me, and I'm going to say, where do you need me? Where do I have to be? And when? And he, again, relates that back to marketing, where people are going to tell you, I don't want what you have to sell. I don't want what you're telling me I should buy. But if you continue to build that relationship, if you continue to be relentless about, I know that I have something great and I know that I want to share it with the world, then there's no reason to give up. And you keep going no matter what. And so that's the best advice that I've ever gotten, because that's my story. That is my life's work, is keep going no matter what. I almost quit at 5 years. And had I quit at that time, I wouldn't have worked with companies like Google or Coldwell Banker, and I wouldn't have worked with people like Kiesha or Steve Harvey or Ted Rubin. And so keep going no matter what. That's the best advice I've ever gotten.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, Jude, thank you. That's absolutely fantastic and wonderful advice. I want to thank you again for taking the time to chat with me. This has been fantastic. If the listeners would like to get a hold of you, check out your website, see more of what you're working on, what is the best place they can go to do that?
The best place to find me is my website, judecharles.co. So my first name, judecharles.co.
Great. I will put a link to that in the show notes so they can also click right through.
Thank you very much for having me, Yuri.
Of course. Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Advance Your Art podcast. If you like this episode, please go into iTunes and give us a 5-star rating. And while you're there, hit the subscribe button so that every single time I release a new episode, it will go directly to you without even thinking about it. If you're interested in hearing older episodes, please go to advanceyourart.com, where you can find the catalog of everything I've done so far, as well as contact information and projects I'm working on. Thank you again, and have a great day.